When a quiet boy shows up at school one morning with an inexplicable fear in his eyes, the first words he shares with his teacher send chills down everyone's spine. What seemed at first like a small matter of nerves unravels to reveal a dark truth. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Eli sat on the very edge of his narrow bed, the thin blanket draped around his shoulders as if it were a shield. A gray morning light filtered through the threadbare curtains of his modest bedroom, merely a corner of the immaculate Hawthorne household. He clutched a spiral-bound sketchbook against his chest, heart pounding at a memory that refused to fade. A memory of raised voices, of fingers digging into his arm, of threats whispered under the cover of darkness. The hush in the house was unnerving at this early hour, but that hush also gave him a moment of temporary safety. He could almost pretend he was free. A watery reflection stared back at him from a tall mirror in the hallway, just outside his door. His hair stood unkempt, deep shadows circled his eyes, and there were faint purplish marks on his arms, marks that had been getting harder to hide at school. Eli was only 12, but the expression he wore might have belonged to someone older and far wearier, a child forced to grow up too soon. As he stood, the floorboards creaked. He froze, breath catching, and listened. No footsteps, no flick of a light switch. Quiet. With a slow exhalation, he gathered his courage, knowing he had to leave soon for Sycamore Middle School. The Hawthorne house was always unsettlingly spotless. It smelled of pine-scented cleaner and lemon polish, every surface gleaming. Photographs hung on the walls, each carefully curated to present Martin and Elise Hawthorne as pillars of the community, fundraisers, charity events, holiday gatherings. In most of the pictures, they stood smiling alongside other foster children they'd hosted over the years. Yet none of those children remained in contact. Eli, forcibly placed here after he was removed from a previous difficult home, felt that same uneasy question rising. How many had come before him, and why had they never stayed? He padded down the stairs, carefully avoiding any squeaks in the floor. His plan was to slip out quickly, to have a moment of quiet before Martin or Elise decided he needed a talk. The memory of that last talk was still fresh, the memory that left the faint bruises on his arm and taught him not to speak out of turn. Especially not about finances, about those locked drawers or the hushed phone calls at odd hours. But as fate would have it, Martin stood in the kitchen, reading a newspaper and sipping coffee from a tall ceramic mug. The man was tall, with precisely parted hair and a neat mustache. He looked like he belonged in a retirement community or a polite country club, not in a house overshadowed by tension and secrecy. He glanced over the paper and saw Eli. "Leaving early?" Martin asked, voice neutral but eyes sharp. Eli swallowed. "Yes," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I have a project to finish." Martin frowned, as if he didn't quite believe that. Then he nodded slowly. "Fine. But you remember what we talked about?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If anyone at that school asks too many questions, about your bruises, about how you're doing..." Eli forced a nod, even as his stomach churned. I know." "Good." Martin backed away. "Now get going." Eli left, hugging his backpack tight, wishing he could vanish in the chilly morning fog. Outside, he felt a hint of relief as he inhaled the crisp air. Sycamore Middle School was a short walk away, and the route took him past quiet suburban streets. Occasionally, a neighbor watering the lawn or a passing jogger would wave. He'd wave back, offering a small, polite smile. No one suspected that behind the neat facade of the Hawthorne home lay something dark and terrifying. Sycamore Middle stood on a tree-lined block, flanked by an old red-brick high school and a sprawling sports field. The school had a warm, lived-in feel. Ivy clung to the walls in patches, colorful student-made posters decorated the windows, and the faint echo of morning announcements drifted through the open front doors. As soon as Eli stepped inside, he felt a different tension, But at least it was the kind that came with daily life. Kids complaining about tests, hallway banter, teachers handing out tardy slips. It was not the hush of fear he felt at home. He made his way to homeroom, taught by Mr. Caldwell, a tall, bespectacled man in his late 30s who wore sweaters with elbow patches. Mr. Caldwell greeted every student with a casual, "Morning, guys," or, "Hey, how's it going?" though his eyes rested on Eli a fraction of a second longer. It was as though the teacher sensed something in the boy's demeanor. Eli forced a half-smile and sunk into his seat at the back of the classroom. "All right, folks," Mr. Caldwell said, clapping his hands. "We have an assignment to finish from yesterday. I need you to get out your notebooks." While classmates rummaged in their bags, Eli pulled out the textbook and binder he'd carefully arranged. But as he did, his sleeve slid up, briefly exposing the edges of a bruise. From across the room, a girl named Olivia, her curly dark hair pinned back with a bright headband, noticed. Her eyes widened. She'd seen these marks before, once or twice, and she'd given him a worried look in the hallway just the other day. Eli quickly tugged his sleeve down. He ducked his head, hoping she wouldn't say anything. As Mr. Caldwell taught the lesson, some introduction to ancient civilizations, Eli struggled to focus. His mind kept drifting to the hush at home, to the stifling tension, and to a locked drawer in Martin's study that he'd once glimpsed. He remembered hearing Martin's voice through the door, talking about transfers, about keeping everything off the record. The boy was only 12, but he wasn't naive enough to think it was innocent. Especially not when Martin's tone turned threatening if Elise questioned him. And Elise, so impeccably dressed, so polite in public, would tense up and nod in tight-lipped compliance. School offered a brief respite. As the day unfolded, Eli moved from class to class in a silent routine. But near lunchtime, everything changed. Mr. Caldwell found him in the corridor, stepping away from a group of chattering students. "Eli," he began in a soft voice, "can I speak with you for a minute?" Eli felt his stomach lurch. This was it, wasn't it? Mr. Caldwell had noticed the bruises. He'd noticed the fear. Eli wondered if he should run, but there was nowhere to go. He nodded, and the teacher led him into an empty classroom. "Is something going on at home?" Mr. Caldwell asked gently, pulling a chair for Eli. "You've been quieter than usual, and I'm worried about those marks on your arms." Eli swallowed. Panic flared within him. He remembered Martin's warning, the stinging memory of a too-tight grip on his shoulder. He bowed his head, fighting tears. And then quietly he whispered something. Not a direct accusation, not an explicit cry for help, but enough to send a chill through Mr. Caldwell. "There are things I can't talk about," Eli said, voice trembling. "But it's not okay. If do they do things?" He trailed off, biting his lip. Mr. Caldwell felt dread coil in his chest. He recognized the trembling fear in the child's posture, the guarded hint in his words. He'd seen it before in a few other kids from troubled backgrounds. "Listen, if something's happening we can help you," Mr. Caldwell said gently. "No one has the right to hurt you." Eli shook his head rapidly. "I can't, if he finds out I said anything." Mr. Caldwell pressed a reassuring hand on Eli's shoulder. "You're safe here at school. Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." Before Eli could respond, the bell rang shrilly, announcing the end of lunch. Footsteps in the hallway signaled the rush of returning students. Mr. Caldwell realized they'd have to pick this up another time. He let Eli go, but not before saying, "My door is always open, okay?" Eli nodded, eyes brimming with confusion and fear. He slipped away as students filled the corridor, disappearing into the crowd. That evening, as Mr. Caldwell sat at home grading papers, he found himself unable to concentrate. He kept recalling the haunted look in Eli's eyes, the bruises that didn't look like normal playground scrapes. He flicked through the school's database, checking what little background information he had on Eli. The boy was listed as a foster child, placed with Martin and Elise Hawthorne about 6 months ago. The Hawthorns were well known in the community for their involvement in charity events and fostering. No red flags in the official record. Still, something about the situation tugged at Mr. Caldwell's memory. Weren't there rumors about the Hawthorns that never quite panned out? He resolved to talk to the school counselor, Mrs. Reed, first thing in the morning. At the Hawthorn house, meanwhile, dinner was a stifling affair. Martin served a polite portion of pasta onto Eli's plate, ignoring the boy's trembling hands. Elise, sitting primly in her seat, asked mundane questions about the school day, about upcoming homework assignments. Eli answered with subdued murmurs. Then, halfway through the meal, Martin asked, "Anything interesting happen today?" Eli's chest constricted. He shook his head. "And no," he lied, focusing on his plate. "Just the usual." Martin's eyes lingered on him. "Good," he said quietly. "That's how it should be." Eli forced himself to finish a few bites. He mumbled an excuse about needing to study. The Hawthorns let him go, but the tension that followed him up the stairs clung to his skin like a cold sweat. Once in his room, he shut the door, pressing his back against it. A part of him wanted to run away, to tell Mr. Caldwell everything. But the memory of Martin's threats, the bruises, the possible repercussions if the Hawthorns discovered he was talking, paralyzed him. With trembling hands, he flipped open his sketchbook. Inside were drawings of twisted silhouettes, looming shadows, and a house with blacked-out windows. On one page, he'd scrawled the words, "They watch me." His throat constricted. He added a small drawing of a teacher's face, someone with kind eyes, maybe Mr. Caldwell. A tiny hope flickered in him that maybe someone cared. Back at school, Mr. Caldwell had already arranged a meeting with Mrs. Reed. She was a slender woman in her 40s, with warm hazel eyes and a calm demeanor that put nervous students at ease. She listened intently as Mr. Caldwell described Eli's behavior, the bruises, and the quiet words the boy had shared. "I've done some check-ins with him before," Mrs. Reed said thoughtfully. "He's always polite but very guarded. I suspected some past trauma, but there was never enough to indicate ongoing abuse. The Hawthorns have a spotless record. They've fostered multiple kids and are active in the community." Mr. Caldwell frowned. "Spotless record or not, something's wrong. I've seen kids trying to hide abuse. The signs match." Mrs. Reed nodded. "I'll talk to him again. If he confirms anything even slightly concrete, we can involve social services. But we need to be sure. Without evidence, it becomes a matter of his word against the Hawthorns' reputation." Later that day, Mrs. Reed found Eli in the hallway and asked if he could stop by her office. He obliged, though his posture was stiff with fear. When they were seated, she smiled gently. "How's it going, Eli? Settling in okay?" He shrugged. "It's fine." "Mr. Caldwell mentioned you seemed upset," Mrs. Reed continued, choosing her words carefully. "Anything on your mind you want to talk about?" Eli swallowed. He looked down at his lap, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "I'm okay," he muttered. "I get nervous sometimes." She leaned forward, her voice soft. "That's understandable. But if something is happening at your foster home, you can tell me." His eyes flickered with fear. "They're just strict. That's all. Nothing's wrong." The bruise on his wrist peeked from under his sleeve, but he kept it hidden as best he could. Mrs. Reed felt a pang of concern. "If it were more than that, I want you to know you're safe to tell me. You won't get in trouble." He hesitated, struggling for words. Then he shook his head again, tears threatening to surface. "I can't. I'm sorry." Mrs. Reed exhaled, heart heavy. "All right," she said quietly, handing him a small card. "If you ever change your mind, or need to talk, call this number or come see me. Anytime." Eli nodded, slipping the card into his pocket. He left with a swirl of relief and dread, hoping Martin would never find that card. Days passed. The bruises on Eli's arms deepened in hue and then faded, replaced by new ones. Olivia, who noticed these details, tried to reach out during lunch or in the hallway, offering silent solidarity. An apple, a seat at her table, a friendly wave. He appreciated her kindness more than he could express, but he was too afraid to confide in anyone fully. Then, a new shock rattled Eli's precarious world. One afternoon, another foster child named Jason returned to town after having been placed with another family months ago. He was close to Eli's age, maybe a year older, and had once been like a brother to him in a previous home. They had lost touch after the Hawthorns took Eli in. But now, Jason reappeared outside Sycamore Middle School, leaning against the fence as classes let out. "Eli," Jason called, stepping forward. "Hey man, it's been a while." Eli froze, startled. "Jason? What are you doing here?" Jason shrugged, his gaze flicking around warily. "Heard you were with the Hawthorns. Just wanted to see if you were, good." Eli's chest clenched. "I'm fine," he managed, but the tremor in his voice gave him away. Jason's eyes narrowed. "You sure? Those people, listen, I heard some rumors about them. Things about money, about how they handle kids." Eli frowned. "Money? Martin's always talking about finances, but I don't know much." Jason lowered his voice, glancing around. "I've seen some records they keep hidden. Like ledgers. People talk about it being a front for something else. The Hawthorns put on a show, but behind the scenes," he trailed off, looking uncertain. Eli felt a surge of fear. "What do you mean?" Jason shook his head. "I don't have all the details. I tried to poke around once, and I got threatened. Be careful, okay? If you see something off, it might be bigger than you realize." Before Eli could question him further, a sleek black car rolled up, Elise Hawthorne, behind the wheel, gesturing for Eli to get in. Panic jolted through him. "I have to go," he whispered. "Thanks, Jason." Jason nodded, stepping back. As Elise's car pulled away, Eli caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were fixed on Jason, her gaze cold and calculating. That night, Eli endured the quiet wrath of Elise, who cornered him in the hall after dinner. "You know that boy, Jason?" she asked in a deceptively soft voice. Eli felt his stomach knot. "He was a friend from my old foster home." Elise's mouth tightened. "We don't want you associating with him anymore. People say he has a habit of telling lies. Understand?" Eli nodded numbly. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she said, turning away, the tension in her shoulders betraying a deeper anger. With each passing day, the Hawthorns seemed more on edge, as if they feared something closing in on them. Unbeknownst to them, Mr. Caldwell and Mrs. Reed were slowly gathering pieces of the puzzle. They quietly asked around, discreetly checking if other teachers had noticed bruises or changes in Eli's behavior. They also discovered that the Hawthorns had multiple financial accounts in different counties, unusual for a mere charity-based family. But it was all circumstantial. They needed something definitive. The school staff, bound by protocol, had to be cautious. In the meantime, they kept an ever-watchful eye on Eli. One evening after a tense dinner, Martin disappeared into his study. Eli heard the door click shut. Normally, Martin was careful not to leave it unlocked, but perhaps in his hurry he forgot. Feeling an odd surge of courage or desperation, Eli tiptoed down the hallway. The dark corridor smelled faintly of Elise's lavender perfume. He paused outside the study door, heart hammering. Inside, Martin was on the phone. Through the thin door, Eli made out snatches of conversation. "I'm telling you, the money has to be moved before the end of the quarter." "Yes, I know it looks suspicious, that's why we keep it off the books." "No, no one suspects a thing. The boy is too afraid to talk. He knows better." Eli's pulse pounded. So there was money being moved in some shady way, and Martin was confident no one would believe a scared foster kid. Eli's hand shook as he gently tried the doorknob. It turned. He edged it open a crack, just enough to see Martin's silhouette at the large desk, a small lamp illuminating scattered folders. On the desk, Eli spotted a ledger with columns of numbers, and what looked like scanned documents with bank logos. He only glimpsed them for a heartbeat before Martin hung up the phone and stood abruptly. Eli scrambled away, pressing himself flat against the wall in the dark hallway. The door swung open, and Martin stepped out, scanning the hall suspiciously. After a tense moment, he headed downstairs. Eli remained motionless, only daring to breathe once the coast was clear. Then he retreated to his room, mind racing with the knowledge that something sinister was definitely going on. It was bigger than just bruises and intimidation. There was a network of corruption, finances hidden away, possibly even illegal activity that fueled the Hawthorns' outwardly charitable lifestyle. The next day at school, Eli felt the weight of this new secret. He debated confiding in Mr. Caldwell, but fear still clutched him. He thought of Jason's warning, "Be careful, it might be bigger than you realize." If he spoke up, would the Hawthorns retaliate before anyone could protect him? At lunch, Olivia sidled up to him. "Hey, you want half my sandwich? You barely touched your food." Eli looked at the brown bag in her hand. "I'm okay," he murmured, though his stomach growled. She insisted, placing half a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on his tray. He managed a small grateful nod. For a moment, they ate in silence. "You know," Olivia said quietly, "if something's wrong, you can tell me. I won't judge. I see how you're always anxious." Eli's eyes flickered. "Thank you," he whispered. He wanted to say more, but the words wouldn't come. Still, her presence was comforting. For a few minutes, they talked about trivial things, favorite TV shows, an upcoming test. It was normal, and Eli clung to that normalcy like a life raft. After lunch, Mr. Caldwell caught him at his locker. "I know it's hard to trust," the teacher said gently, "but if you need to share anything—" Eli looked away, frustration and fear mixing in his chest. Then, gathering courage, he said, "It's not just me. There's something they're doing financially. I don't know the details, but it's shady. They have these ledgers, phone calls." Mr. Caldwell's expression shifted, from concern to alarm. "You overheard them?" Eli nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't see much, but they said they keep money off the books. They threatened me not to talk." Mr. Caldwell hesitated, absorbing this. "Okay," he said at last. "This could be very serious. I'm going to speak with Mrs. Reed again. We might need to bring in authorities who handle more than just foster matters." Panic flared in Eli's eyes. "But what if they find out I told you?" Mr. Caldwell rested a hand on Eli's shoulder. "We'll do everything we can to protect you." That afternoon, Mr. Caldwell and Mrs. Reed arranged a discreet call with a social services representative, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Gillespie, who specialized in investigating foster home misconduct. They relayed their concerns, both about potential abuse and possible financial crimes. Ms. Gillespie promised a preliminary check, but cautioned that she needed tangible evidence, documents, statements, or at least another witness. Meanwhile, tension at the Hawthorn house reached a boiling point. Martin grew more short-tempered, Elise walked around with taut shoulders, and the phone calls became more frequent and urgent. Eli tiptoed around them, praying not to provoke anger. But late one evening, he awoke to shouting from downstairs. Curiosity overcame fear, and he crept to the top of the stairs. Below, in the living room, Martin stood with a phone pressed to his ear, while Elise argued in hushed, frantic tones. Eli caught words like wire transfer, bouncing accounts, someone is asking questions. The conversation ended abruptly with Martin slamming the phone down. He muttered a curse, then hissed something about the boy and the school. Elise nodded, looking pale. Eli's heart thundered. They suspected him. Without thinking, he hurried back to his room and locked the door, sinking onto his bed, forcing himself to breathe. He felt certain Martin would confront him, but the house remained eerily silent the rest of the night. Only in the morning did Martin say, "We need to talk when you get home from school," a quiet threat lacing each syllable. That day at Sycamore Middle, Eli could hardly concentrate in class. He was certain that if he went back to the Hawthorns' house alone, something terrible would happen. As the last bell rang, anxiety made him linger in the corridor. Then he spotted Jason again, near the entrance, as if waiting for him. "I got a lead," Jason said when Eli approached. "They're moving money between different foster agencies. It's not just about physically hurting kids, they're profiting off each placement, forging documents." Eli's breath caught. "What do I do?" Jason seemed troubled. "Tell someone. The cops maybe. I've tried, but no one took me seriously. They always see the Hawthorns as good Samaritans. But if you back me up, maybe they'll listen." Eli closed his eyes, dread swamping him. "I'm scared," he admitted. "They threaten me. I have to go home or they'll come looking." Jason placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "You're not alone, man. There are teachers here who believe you. And me. I'll stand by you." Buoyed by that brief moment of solidarity, Eli found Mr. Caldwell in the faculty lounge. The teacher was about to leave for the day, keys in hand. "I can't go back," Eli whispered, voice trembling. "They know I've said something. Martin wants to talk, and that always means—" He faltered, fear choking him. Mr. Caldwell's expression darkened. "I'm not letting you go back alone," he said. "We'll call Ms. Gillespie right now." Together they did just that. Ms. Gillespie, on the phone, sounded alarmed. "I'll arrange for a protective order if we can verify immediate risk," she said. "But we need a statement from Eli. Are you sure he's ready to officially accuse them?" Eli's heart raced. To place an official statement on record meant crossing a line of no return. "If I don't," he said, "they're going to do something worse. I can't keep living like this." That was enough for Ms. Gillespie. She asked them to bring Eli to the social services office. Mr. Caldwell glanced at the clock. "Well past 4 p.m., we'll go now," he said. "I'll drive him." Outside, the sky was turning a stormy gray, matching Eli's mood. As they walked to the parking lot, thunder rumbled in the distance. Mr. Caldwell's old sedan started up with a sputter, and they pulled out, heading downtown. The sense of urgency and fear escalated with each passing minute. A quiet tension filled the car. Eli stared out the window, hugging his backpack, mind spinning with worry about how Martin and Elise would react. But the teacher's presence was comforting, like a shield. They arrived at a squat gray building that housed several government services offices. Ms. Gillespie met them in the lobby, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, paperwork in hand. "In here," she said gently, leading them to a small conference room with fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly. A battered table, a few chairs, a battered potted plant in the corner, no frills. But it was somewhere safer than the Hawthorns' living room. Ms. Gillespie motioned for Eli to sit, then turned on a tape recorder. "Whenever you're ready, Eli." He took a shaky breath and began to speak. Slowly at first, describing the bruises, the threatening words, the night he overheard phone calls about hidden money. Mr. Caldwell sat by his side, offering a calm, encouraging nod when Eli's voice cracked. Ms. Gillespie listened intently, occasionally jotting notes, asking clarifying questions. It took nearly an hour. By the end, Eli was emotionally exhausted, tears hanging at the corners of his eyes. Ms. Gillespie turned off the recorder. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know how hard that was." Mr. Caldwell asked, "What happens now?" She gathered her papers. "We'll proceed with an emergency protective order to keep Eli away from the Hawthorns. I'll contact the police about the possible financial crimes. We might need you to testify if this goes to court, Eli." Eli paled. "Testify? But they'll hate me." Ms. Gillespie's expression was sympathetic but resolute. "It's part of bringing them to justice. We can't ignore what they're doing, especially if it involves hurting other kids or funneling money illegally." A wave of relief and terror washed over Eli. He was stepping into a new storm, but at least he wasn't alone. Mr. Caldwell assured him, "I'll help you any way I can." That night, Ms. Gillespie placed Eli in a temporary foster home for immediate safety, a caring older woman named Mrs. Morales who had done emergency placements for years. Her cozy home smelled of freshly baked bread, and she greeted Eli with a warm hug. "You're safe here," she promised, showing him to a small guest bedroom. It was plain but comfortable, a far cry from the pristine but threatening Hawthorne house. Meanwhile, Martin and Elise discovered, to their outrage, that Eli hadn't returned home. They made frantic phone calls, searching for him. Their anger turned to cunning. Elise insisted to neighbors that he'd run away, painting them as worried guardians. But the next morning, 2 police officers visited them with a notice that Eli was under protective custody, pending investigation of abuse and possible financial crimes. Martin's face went rigid. Elise feigned shock, claiming they were being framed by a troubled boy. Word spread quickly around Sycamore Middle that Eli was gone. Olivia looked worried, but Mr. Caldwell and Mrs. Reed offered vague reassurance that he was taken care of. Jason, upon hearing the news, felt a rush of hope that maybe the Hawthorns' secrets would finally be exposed. However, the fight was far from over. The Hawthorns had resources, connections, a sterling public reputation. A few days later, Ms. Gillespie informed Eli that the Hawthorns had lawyered up. They were challenging the protective order, insisting no abuse occurred and accusing him of making false allegations. The hearing date was set for a few weeks away. Eli's stomach twisted at the thought of facing them in court, but Ms. Gillespie, along with Mr. Caldwell, reassured him that the evidence was mounting. In the meantime, the police discovered suspicious bank statements. However, they needed more: the actual ledger, recordings, or an eyewitness. Eli remembered the locked desk drawer in Martin's study. "I saw papers," he told Ms. Gillespie. "I saw them once, but never close enough to read everything." Jason, too, came forward, providing his own account of the Hawthorns' intimidation tactics and references to money. It helped paint a broader picture, but still might not be enough to secure convictions without concrete documentation. Another staff member at Sycamore Middle, someone from the finance department, quietly mentioned that the Hawthorns had donated irregular sums to the school, sometimes in cash. That, Ms. Gillespie realized, was yet another thread in the tapestry of corruption. As days turned to weeks, Eli settled into a cautious routine at Mrs. Morales's home. She was kind, never prying, but gently ensuring he ate, did his homework, and felt comfortable. Mr. Caldwell visited often, bringing reading materials or just chatting about everyday things. For the first time in what felt like ages, Eli could relax without constantly looking over his shoulder. But the looming court hearing weighed on him, particularly because the Hawthorns had begun a smear campaign, hinting that Eli was a troubled child with a history of making up stories, pointing to prior foster placements. One evening, Olivia visited Mrs. Morales's house with her mother's permission, bringing homemade cookies. She found Eli in the small living room, doodling in his sketchbook. "Hey," she said softly, handing him a box of chocolate chip cookies. "I'm glad you're okay. I was worried." "Thanks," Eli said, managing a small smile. He hesitated, then showed her a sketch of a tall figure overshadowing a tiny child. This was how it felt in that house. She bit her lip. "I'm so sorry, Eli. I wish I'd known how bad it was." He shrugged. "You tried to be nice. That helped more than you know." They talked about school gossip, about an upcoming art contest that Mr. Caldwell was encouraging them to join. For a moment, Eli felt like a regular kid, discussing trivial matters with a friend. But inside, he knew the fight wasn't over. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. A tense hush seemed to follow Eli as Ms. Gillespie guided him into a drab courthouse lobby. Mr. Caldwell stood by for moral support. The Hawthorns were already there with their lawyer, Martin in a crisp suit, Elise in a conservative dress. They looked every bit the concerned foster parents wronged by a malicious rumor. Eli's heart pounded when Martin's cold gaze met his. He remembered nights of being grabbed by the arm, vile threats whispered in his ear. He fought the urge to cower. The hearing would determine whether Eli would remain in protective custody or be forced back into the Hawthorns' home until a full trial. The judge, a stern woman with gray hair pinned in a bun, read through statements from Ms. Gillespie, from the police, from Mr. Caldwell and Mrs. Reed. The Hawthorns' lawyer rose, painting them as philanthropic caretakers. Elise even mustered tears, insisting they'd never harmed Eli, that he was troubled, that he'd fabricated stories. Martin nodded along, exuding calm righteousness. But then Eli was asked to speak. Voice shaking, he described the bruises, the threats, the overheard phone calls about off-the-books finances. He mentioned how the Hawthorns always kept a ledger locked away and how they donated money in weird lumps to organizations. Ms. Gillespie presented partial police findings, pointing to suspicious transactions. Mr. Caldwell added his observations about Eli's growing terror over time. Even Jason gave a short statement about how he'd tried to raise concerns months ago. The judge listened gravely. At one point she asked, "Eli, do you feel safe returning to the Hawthorne household pending further investigation?" Eli's eyes brimmed with tears. "No," he said, voice trembling. "They threaten me. They say they'll hurt me if I go back." Martin's lawyer objected, calling it hearsay, but the judge overruled. Ultimately, she ruled in favor of maintaining the protective order, stating that the evidence, while circumstantial, was substantial enough to warrant caution. The Hawthorns left the courtroom in stony silence, their eyes brimming with resentment, while Eli sagged with relief, clutching Mr. Caldwell's arm. It was a temporary victory, but a crucial one. He wouldn't be forced back. As the investigation deepened, the police discovered more threads linking the Hawthorns to a ring of questionable financial dealings, possibly involving other unscrupulous foster parents. Jason's testimony gained traction when another former foster child came forward. The Hawthorns, growing desperate, tried to shift blame onto non-existent co-conspirators, or claimed ignorance of the ledger's real content. But each denial rang hollow. Still, the final showdown loomed. The district attorney decided to press charges for fraud and child endangerment. A date was set for a criminal trial. Meanwhile, Child Protective Services moved toward terminating the Hawthorns' foster license. On the personal front, Ms. Gillespie approached Mr. Caldwell with a surprising question. "Have you considered applying to become Eli's permanent guardian if the court severs the Hawthorns' rights?" Mr. Caldwell was taken aback. "Well, I want Eli to have a stable home, absolutely. But me? I'm single, I have a small apartment. I'm his teacher, would that even be allowed?" She nodded. "It's unconventional but not impossible. You're one of the few stable adult figures he trusts. We have to see if the system allows it, but it might be an option if you're willing." That possibility planted a seed in Mr. Caldwell's mind. He'd grown incredibly fond of Eli, protective of him. Still, it was a monumental decision, and he fretted over the logistics. He decided to wait until after the trial to see how things played out, while quietly preparing his home for a potential child occupant, just in case. As the trial approached, the tension soared. The prosecution, armed with new evidence from the ledger, which the police had finally seized in a raid, and testimonies from multiple foster children, built a powerful case. The Hawthorns had been siphoning funds from charity events and from foster care stipends, forging receipts, and laundering money through various channels. Physical abuse claims were coupled with these charges, presenting a twisted picture of a superficially loving couple who exploited the system and intimidated any child who dared speak up. Eli, dread pooling in his gut, steeled himself to testify publicly in a courtroom. Unlike the smaller hearing, this was the real deal. A jury, a full gallery, a stern-faced judge with the power to put the Hawthorns behind bars. Mr. Caldwell sat with him in a small waiting area before he took the stand. "You can do this," the teacher said gently, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're strong." Eli nodded, though his pulse raced. Ms. Gillespie helped him practice potential questions he might face from the defense lawyer. She warned him they would try to discredit him, make him sound unreliable. He braced himself for that humiliating possibility. When his moment came, he walked to the witness stand, feeling eyes on him like knives. Martin and Elise sat with their defense team, stony-faced. Their lawyer opened with a barrage of questions about Eli's past fosters, about possible psychological issues. Eli's voice trembled, but he held firm. He recalled how Martin's grip left bruises, how Elise threatened him if he talked. He described in detail the hush in the house, the suspicious phone calls about moving money, the locked desk drawer. The lawyer sneered, "You're quite the imaginative child, aren't you, Eli?" He swallowed. "I'm not making it up," he whispered. "I wish I was." The prosecution presented the physical ledger and additional evidence from bank statements. They called Jason and other children to testify, each describing intimidation tactics. They showed records of how the Hawthorns' accounts ballooned after taking in certain fosters, how donations to the school sometimes coincided with large unaccounted-for withdrawals. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed a damning picture. The final nail came from one of Martin's old associates, who turned witness in exchange for leniency, testifying that Martin orchestrated a ring of foster parents gaming the system. Still, the Hawthorns tried to maintain their façade, teary pleas of innocence, claims of being framed. But the evidence was overwhelming. After a tense week of arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. Eli, exhausted, sat in a waiting area with Mr. Caldwell, Ms. Gillespie, Jason, and a few others who'd testified. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, the verdict: guilty on multiple counts, financial fraud, child endangerment, intimidation. Martin and Elise Hawthorn looked stunned, their carefully cultivated masks shattering. Martin's fury was barely contained. Elise sobbed dramatically. The judge ordered them taken into custody. A hush fell over the courtroom. For Eli, the moment was a whirlwind of relief and residual terror. He realized that, at last, they couldn't hurt him anymore. The system had believed him, believed all the children. Mr. Caldwell pulled him into a gentle hug, voice catching as he whispered, "You did it. It's over." A swirl of media attention followed the trial, headlines about foster care fraud ring busted, and brave youths testify against corrupt guardians. Eli was thrust into an unwanted spotlight, but Ms. Gillespie shielded him as much as possible. As the shock wore off, he faced the question of where he would live permanently. Mrs. Morales was wonderful, but the arrangement was temporary. Then, one quiet evening, Ms. Gillespie sat with Eli at Mrs. Morales's kitchen table, fiddling with some papers. "We've been reviewing your case," she said, "and Mr. Caldwell has filed a petition to become your permanent guardian, eventually your adoptive parent if you're comfortable with that." Eli's breath caught. He wants to adopt me?" She smiled gently. "Yes. He cares a lot about you. He wants to give you a stable home." Emotions flooded Eli: relief, joy, fear, hope. He'd never imagined a teacher might step in like that, but thinking back on Mr. Caldwell's unwavering kindness, it made sense. A few days later, Mr. Caldwell visited, awkwardly explaining that he had a small house, but a spare room he was turning into a bedroom. "Only if you want," he said, fumbling with his glasses. "I don't want to pressure you." "I'd be honored to have you." Tears gathered in Eli's eyes. He found himself nodding, heart pounding. I want that," he whispered. It wasn't an immediate process: bureaucracy, home inspections, psychological evaluations. But having emerged from the Hawthorn nightmare, Eli felt renewed purpose to keep fighting for his future. Jason, who had become a close friend, cheered him on from his own stable foster situation. Olivia visited after school, excitedly discussing how the art teacher planned to host a year-end gallery event for student drawings. "You should enter," she said. "You're so good." Eli was still hesitant about his dark sketches, but slowly he found himself creating brighter pieces. A sunrise, children playing, a school hallway full of light. The transformation in his drawings mirrored the transformation in his life, shifting from fear to hope. Eventually, a family court date arrived to finalize his permanent guardianship. The hearing was simpler than the criminal trial, more of a warm administrative process, though no less nerve-wracking for Eli. Mr. Caldwell stood beside him, Ms. Gillespie at their side, explaining that Eli would officially become part of Mr. Caldwell's household. The judge, smiling kindly, congratulated them. Mr. Caldwell placed a hand on Eli's shoulder as they left the courtroom. "Ready to go home?" he asked, voice filled with emotion. Eli's chest felt light, tears threatening to spill. "Yeah," he whispered. "Home." When they arrived at Mr. Caldwell's small, cozy house, the living room was full of school staff and a few of Eli's new friends, Olivia, Jason, Mrs. Reed, even Ms. Gillespie. They'd organized a low-key celebration with balloons, a homemade banner that said, "Welcome home, Eli." The boy stood in the doorway, heart pounding with gratitude. Everyone clapped and cheered. "Congratulations!" Olivia exclaimed, thrusting a small potted plant into his hands. "For your new room." Eli smiled, genuinely, tears brimming. "Thank you," he said, voice trembling. The next weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. Eli had a new routine, new responsibilities, helping Mr. Caldwell with grocery shopping, doing chores around the house. Mr. Caldwell, in turn, learned to manage the needs of a preteen, school events, medical checkups, everyday emotional support. They had awkward moments but also shared small joys, like discovering they both loved detective novels and had a knack for late-night hot chocolate sessions. Eli's nightmares about the Hawthorns gradually subsided. Sometimes he'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced he heard Martin's footsteps or Elisa's whispered threats. But Mr. Caldwell was always there to reassure him, "They can't hurt you anymore. They're in prison." With time, those nightmares faded. At school, Ms. Reed watched Eli blossom. No longer withdrawn, he participated in class discussions, joined an after-school art club, and even played a small part in a group presentation on social justice. The boy who once hid bruises and secrets was now stepping into the light. One afternoon, Mr. Caldwell and Mrs. Reed found an opportunity to talk privately. She smiled. "I'm so happy for Eli. He's come a long way." Mr. Caldwell nodded, an emotional catch in his voice. "I never expected to be a father, but I can't imagine things any other way now." In the months that followed, the community recognized the heroism of the children who testified. Newspaper articles praised them for exposing corruption in the foster system, prompting investigations into other suspicious guardians. The Hawthorns, forced to face the consequences of their actions, appealed but were denied. Their once pristine reputations lay in ruins. Eli's final victory came at the end of the school year, during the art club's showcase. He submitted a series of drawings titled, "From Shadows to Light." The first panels showed dark silhouettes and caged figures, the later ones depicting open doorways and radiant possibilities. As visitors strolled through the gallery in the school gym, many were moved by the raw, honest journey depicted. Eli stood nervously to one side, wearing a neat shirt and tie, face flushed. Olivia bounded up, beaming. "People keep talking about your pieces," she said. "Everyone wants to know the story behind them." Eli smiled softly. "They're my story, I guess. But also for everyone who's ever felt trapped." Mr. Caldwell approached, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. "They're wonderful," he said quietly. "I'm proud of you." When the event ended, the school principal congratulated Eli for his courage. Mrs. Reed snapped photos. Jason gave a thumbs up from across the crowd. Ms. Gillespie, who had come to show support, smiled warmly, reminding Eli how far he'd come since that first day he confided in Mr. Caldwell. After the gym emptied, Eli lingered, gazing at one final drawing. A self-portrait of a boy stepping out of a house overshadowed by tall, menacing silhouettes. Behind him, a bright sun rose, illuminating a path lined with new friends and supportive figures. In the corner, he'd signed it with a flourish. It was a reminder of what he'd endured, and how he refused to be defined by it. Later that night, back at Mr. Caldwell's house, they ordered pizza to celebrate. As they lounged on the couch, a stack of art supplies by Eli's feet, he asked, "So, do you think everything that happened, is it behind me now?" Mr. Caldwell considered the question, then spoke gently. "You'll still have memories, maybe some scars. But those people can't hurt you or anyone else. You've stopped them. You've grown stronger than you know." Eli gazed at the box of pizza, picking at the cheese thoughtfully. "I want to help other kids," he said, voice quiet but sure. "Kids who are scared like I was." "You already are," Mr. Caldwell replied with a smile. "Just by telling your story." Eli felt warmth spread through his chest. Indeed, this was a new chapter, one defined not by fear, but by purpose. He still had therapy sessions, still grappled with the occasional pang of insecurity, but every day was a step forward. The legal system was no longer his enemy but a tool to protect him, and he had a place to call home, with someone who genuinely cared. In the months to come, the repercussions of the Hawthorne case rippled through the foster care community, prompting stricter oversight and new policies to prevent similar corruption. Ms. Gillespie championed reform, citing Eli's bravery as a catalyst for real change. Jason, no longer living under threat, found a stable placement and stayed in touch with Eli, often marveling at how their testimonies sparked something bigger than themselves. Occasionally, Eli would think of the pristine floors of the Hawthorne house, the forced politeness of Elise, Martin's controlling presence. But those thoughts no longer paralyzed him. Instead, they reminded him of what he'd overcome. He channeled that energy into his art, each pencil stroke a testament to his resilience. Toward the end of summer, a community event was held in the local park, a sort of festival celebrating foster families, spotlighting success stories, and raising awareness about the importance of protective measures. Mr. Caldwell and Eli attended together, strolling past booths that offered resources for foster children, balloon stands, and face-painting stations. People recognized Eli from the newspapers, though he blushed at the attention. A short presentation was held on a small stage. Ms. Gillespie spoke about the improvements in the foster care system. Then she invited Eli up to share a bit about his journey. Nervous but determined, he walked onto the stage with Mr. Caldwell at his side. "Hi," Eli said into the microphone, voice wavering. "I'm Eli. I used to be afraid to say anything about the bad stuff happening in my life because I thought no one would believe me. I was lucky. I found people who cared, my teacher, Mr. Caldwell, my friends at school, Ms. Gillespie. They helped me speak up. And because of that, I'm safe now, and I have a real home." He paused, scanning the small crowd, the families, the kids. "I just want to say, if you're scared, if you're hurt, please don't give up. There are people who will listen." A swell of applause rose. Mr. Caldwell squeezed Eli's shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. It felt like a true conclusion to the darkest chapter of Eli's life. Or maybe not a conclusion, perhaps just a turning point from which he could move forward with hope. After the festival, they walked home together under a warm sunset. Crickets chirped, and the sky glowed pink and gold. Eli felt content, a lightness in his chest. He thought of how far he'd come since that day he first showed up at Sycamore Middle School, bruises hidden, voice trembling. That night, sitting at the dining table, Mr. Caldwell and Eli looked over some paperwork. It was the official adoption packet. They'd done the guardianship, but now Mr. Caldwell wanted to make it permanent. "You don't have to sign anything if you're not ready," Mr. Caldwell said gently. Eli smiled, tears welling up. "I'm ready." So they signed. And just like that, the final piece of his new life fell into place. No more drifting through a system that didn't care. No more living in fear that the Hawthorns would resurface. He had a father now, a home, and the courage to face whatever the future held. That final step, ironically, felt quieter than all the storms that came before. The next day, they resumed their everyday routine. Eli woke to the smell of coffee and toast, got dressed for school, and they drove there together, chatting about classes. But everything had shifted. As they pulled up to Sycamore Middle, Mr. Caldwell turned to him with a small grin. "Have a good day, son." Eli's chest clenched with gratitude at the simple word, son. He grinned back. "Thanks, Dad." He hopped out of the car, hoisting his backpack. The school building loomed, but now it felt like a second home. No dread, no secrecy. Just the normal challenges of a 7th grader, homework, projects, maybe some jokes in the cafeteria with Olivia. Stepping inside, he realized how alive the hallways felt. The chatter of friends, the squeak of sneakers on tiled floors, the swirl of backpacks in motion. This was his world now, one he had helped shape by revealing the truth. The teacher who had once spotted his bruises was now the father who waited to drive him home, never raising a hand in anger, always encouraging him to keep drawing, to keep speaking up. Eli headed to class, passing a display case in the hallway that showcased student art. He noticed his own piece featured prominently, the bright painting of a child opening a door to sunlight. A small placard read, "By Eli Caldwell." The sight made him pause and smile. He touched the glass lightly, remembering all he'd endured and the strength he discovered within himself. Then the bell rang, echoing through the corridors. Students hurried past, and Eli joined them, forging ahead into the day, into his future, no longer afraid, no longer alone, secure in the knowledge that truth had indeed come to light. The betrayal had been exposed, the darkness banished. And in its place, he'd found a relentless kind of hope, fueled by compassion and justice, forming the family he'd always needed. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartfelt stories, and let me know if you got to the end by commenting, "I made it to the end." Until next time, bye-bye.